Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy History Facts channel. Tonight we are stepping into one of the oldest and most enduring stories the human imagination has ever produced. The story of Pandora and her box, a story so old that it predates most of what we think of as recorded history. A story so powerful that it has been told and retold and reimagined and argued about for nearly 3,000 years and shows no sign of stopping. You already know the shape of it, even if you have never read the original. A woman. A container she was told not to open. A moment of curiosity. And everything that followed from that moment. The story of Pandora is one of the founding myths of Western civilization. And like all the best founding myths, it contains within it a set of questions that its culture could not answer directly, but could not stop asking. Why does the world contain suffering? Why do human beings get sick and grow old and die? Why is life so much harder than it seems it ought to be? Why do we keep hoping even when hope seems unreasonable? These are not questions that have simple answers. The ancient Greeks knew that. And so instead of answering them directly, they told a story. A story about a woman created by the gods and given to the world as both a gift and a punishment. A story about a jar filled with everything dark and difficult in human experience, and about what was left inside it when the darkness escaped. A story that has been with us so long that the phrase Pandora's box has entered almost every language on earth as a way of describing any action that releases consequences too numerous and too complex to contain again. But the story is stranger and richer and more interesting than the phrase suggests. And tonight, we are going to explore all of it. The gods who made Pandora, the man who accepted her, the jar she opened, the world she changed, and the one thing that stayed inside when everything else had gone. If these quiet journeys through the ancient world bring you some peace tonight, I would love it if you liked or subscribed or left a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, all you need to do is settle in. Let your body grow heavy. Let your breathing slow. And as the night gathers around you, come with me to the beginning, to the world before Pandora, to the age when the gods were young and human beings had not yet learned what they were going to lose. Let us begin. The world before Pandora was called the Golden Age, and it was a world without suffering. To understand what Pandora's arrival meant, you have to understand what the world was like before she came. The ancient Greeks described the earliest age of humanity as a golden age, an era of perfect ease and abundance in which human beings lived like gods themselves, free from toil and sorrow and disease and the fear of death. The earth provided everything they needed without being asked. Grain grew without ploughing. Fruit hung heavy on unpruned trees. The rivers ran with milk and honey. Human beings did not need to work. They did not need to fight. They did not grow old in the painful way that we experience aging as a slow diminishment of capacity and strength. Instead, they simply faded gently from life, as though falling into a long and comfortable sleep. There was no illness, no hunger, no poverty, no war, no grinding labor in the fields, no sorrow. The gods and human beings lived together in a relationship of ease that was closer to companionship than to the distant and sometimes hostile relationship that characterized later Greek religion. This is the world that the myth of Pandora explains the loss of. It is not a world that can be recovered, or that the Greeks expected to recover. It is the world as it might have been, set against the world as it is. as a way of making the gap between the two feel like something that happened rather than something that simply is. The gap between the Golden Age and the world of ordinary human experience is not simply a matter of material comfort. It is a gap in the relationship between human beings and the divine. In the Golden Age, the gods were present. In the world after Pandora, they are absent, or at least distant, and human beings must negotiate their existence without the easy divine companionship that the first humans enjoyed. The myth of Pandora is therefore not only about the origin of suffering, it is about the origin of the human condition as such, about what it means to be a mortal creature in a world that is indifferent to your suffering and that requires effort and endurance simply to survive. The Greeks told this story not to make themselves feel worse about their situation, but to make it comprehensible, to place it in a narrative that gave it a cause and a context, and that made the suffering of human life feel like something that happened to people rather than something that was simply the nature of existence without explanation. The Titans and the gods and the cosmic war that preceded Pandora. Before Pandora, there was a war. The universe that produced the myth of Pandora was not a peaceful one, even in its divine dimensions. Before the Olympian gods whom the Greeks worshipped, Zeus and Hera and Athena and Apollo and all the rest, there were the Titans, the earlier generation of divine beings who had ruled the cosmos before being overthrown by their own children. The war between the Titans and the Olympians, the Titanomachy, lasted 10 years according to the myths, and was fought with a violence and a cosmic intensity that shook the universe to its foundations. The Olympians eventually won with the help of the Cyclopes, who forged the thunderbolts that Zeus used as his primary weapon, and with the help of the Hecaton shares, the 100-handed giants, whose ability to hurl mountains at the Titans proved decisive in the final battle. The Titans were defeated and imprisoned in Tartarus, the deepest and darkest region beneath the earth, where they remained for the rest of time in a darkness and a confinement that reflected the totality of their defeat. 2 Titans were exceptions to this general imprisonment. Atlas, who was condemned to hold up the sky on his shoulders for eternity, a punishment that expressed in physical form the burden of having been on the losing side of a cosmic war. And Prometheus. Prometheus was a Titan who had sided with the Olympians during the war, or who had at least remained neutral and then switched sides at a crucial moment when the outcome became clear. His name means forethought in Greek, and his defining characteristic was exactly that. He could see what was coming. He understood consequences. He made decisions based on what they would produce, rather than what they felt like in the moment. His brother Epimetheus, whose name means afterthought, was his opposite. Epimetheus acted first and understood the consequences afterward, a characteristic that would prove consequential when the gods sent Pandora into the world and Epimetheus received her despite his brother's warnings. Prometheus and Epimetheus were given the task by the gods of equipping the creatures of the earth with the qualities they needed to survive. Epimetheus did the actual work of distribution, while Prometheus supervised. Epimetheus gave speed to some animals and strength to others. He gave thick fur and warm hides to some, and shells to others. He gave wings to birds and fins to fish and claws and teeth to the predators. By the time he reached humanity, he had run out of gifts. Every useful quality had been given away to animals already, and humanity was left naked, slow, weak, and defenseless in a world full of creatures better equipped than they were. It was Prometheus who solved this problem, and the solution he chose was the direct cause of Pandora. Prometheus stole fire from the gods and gave it to humanity, and what that act cost him. The theft of fire by Prometheus is one of the most powerful stories in all of Greek mythology, and one that has generated more philosophical and artistic response than almost any other single myth in the ancient tradition. Fire, in the context of the myth, is not simply a flame. It is the symbol of all human technological capacity. The ability to cook food, to forge metal, to make pottery, to provide warmth, to create light in the darkness, to drive away the wild animals, to build civilizations in places that would otherwise be uninhabitable. Fire is the technology that makes human civilization possible, and Prometheus gave it to humanity by stealing it from the gods on Mount Olympus and carrying it down to earth in a hollow fennel stalk. The image of fire being carried in a fennel stalk is specific and deliberate. The pith of the giant fennel, Ferula communis, burns slowly and can carry a smouldering coal for a considerable distance without burning through the stalk itself. It was a practical method of transporting fire in the ancient world, and its appearance in the myth grounds the story in the physical reality of ancient Greek life, in a way that makes the theft feel like a real event rather than a purely symbolic one. Zeus's anger at the theft of fire was absolute and immediate. Fire was the property of the gods. Its possession by humanity upset the balance of power between the mortal and the divine in ways that Zeus found intolerable. If human beings had fire, they had the beginning of civilization. If they had civilization, they had the potential to challenge the gods in ways that earlier generations of divine beings had found it necessary to suppress. The punishment that Zeus devised for Prometheus was one of the most brutal in all of mythology. Prometheus was chained to a rock on a mountain, sometimes identified as the Caucasus, and each day an eagle, which was Zeus's sacred bird, came and ate his liver. Each night the liver grew back. Each morning the eagle returned. The punishment was designed to last forever, because Prometheus was immortal and could not die from the torment, however extreme it became. The liver was chosen deliberately. In ancient Greek medicine, it was considered the seat of human emotion and vitality. To have it eaten daily was to have the most essential part of yourself consumed and regenerated in an endless cycle of violation and renewal that expressed perfectly the nature of the punishment Zeus intended. Prometheus endured this torment for an enormous span of time before being eventually freed by Heracles, the greatest of the Greek heroes, who shot the eagle and broke the chains in an act of liberation that is itself one of the most celebrated moments in Greek mythology. But the freeing of Prometheus came later. Before that liberation came Pandora. The punishment of Prometheus was only the first part of Zeus's response to the theft of fire. The second part was aimed not at the Titan who had stolen it, but at the human beings who had received it. The creation of Pandora and what each god contributed to her making. Zeus's plan for punishing humanity was both ingenious and cruel in the way that the most powerful forms of punishment often are. Rather than taking fire back, which would have been difficult and which would have created ongoing conflict with Prometheus, Zeus decided to give humanity something alongside fire that would ensure their suffering, regardless of what fire enabled them to build. He ordered the creation of a woman, not simply any woman, but a perfect woman, beautiful and accomplished and appealing in every way, who would be given to the world as a gift and who would carry within her the source of all future human suffering. The creation of Pandora was a collaborative project of the Olympian gods in which each deity contributed something of their own domain to the making of this new being. Hephaestus, the smith god, creator of divine artifacts and divine weapons, was tasked with shaping her physical form. He fashioned her from earth and water, the basic elements of mortal life, giving her a body of extraordinary beauty and a face that would make gods and men alike stop and stare. Athena, goddess of wisdom and crafts, dressed her in silver robes and taught her the skills of weaving that were considered the defining female accomplishment in ancient Greece. Aphrodite, goddess of love and desire, poured grace and longing over her and gave her a beauty that was not merely physical, but that created in those who looked at her a desire to possess and to be near her that they could not easily explain or resist. Hermes, messenger of the gods and patron of thieves and tricksters, gave her a deceitful mind and a persuasive voice, the ability to lie convincingly and to make untrue things seem true. The Graces adorned her with golden necklaces. The seasons crowned her with spring flowers. Each gift was both genuine and double-edged. The beauty that Aphrodite gave her was real beauty, but it was beauty in the service of a purpose that the recipient of that beauty could not see. The voice that Hermes gave her was genuinely persuasive, but the persuasiveness served deception. The skills that Athena gave her were real skills, but they were the skills of a creation whose ultimate function was not the enrichment of humanity, but its punishment. The name Pandora means all gifted in Greek. She was all gifted because every god had given her something. But the name also carries within it the word forgiving, and the question of whether the gifts she brought to the world were truly gifts or something more complicated is one that the myth has been asking ever since it was first told. The meaning of Pandora's name and what it reveals about the myth. The name Pandora is rich with meaning in Greek, and scholars have been arguing about its precise significance for as long as classical studies has existed as a discipline. The most straightforward reading is all gifted, meaning a being who has received gifts from all the gods. This reading fits the narrative perfectly. Pandora was made by collective divine effort, and each contributor gave something of their domain. But there is a second possible reading of the name that is equally consistent with the Greek etymology, and that changes the meaning of the myth in subtle but important ways. Pandora can also be read as all-giving, meaning a being who gives everything, who is herself the source of all that comes from her. In this reading, Pandora is not simply the recipient of divine gifts, but the originating source of what she releases into the world. She does not merely open the jar. She is the jar. She is the container from which human suffering and human hope both emerge. This reading connects the myth to a much older tradition of earth goddesses and mother figures who were understood as the source of both life and death, both nourishment and destruction, both the fertility of the earth and the diseases that killed what grew there. Some scholars have argued that the Pandora myth is a later, patriarchal revision of a much older goddess tradition, in which Pandora was not a punishment at all, but a divine feminine principle of generativity and abundance. In this reading the myth, as Hesiod tells, it represents a transformation of an older, more positive female figure into a source of danger and suffering that reflects the changing gender politics of archaic Greek society. Whether or not this reconstruction is correct, the double meaning of the name itself preserves within it the tension between the two readings. Is Pandora a gift or a curse? Is she all gifted, receiving everything from others, or all giving, the source from which everything flows? The myth does not answer this question cleanly, and perhaps that is intentional. The best myths hold their contradictions without resolving them, because the contradictions are the point. Epimetheus and why he accepted Pandora despite his brother's warning. Prometheus had warned his brother Epimetheus not to accept any gift from Zeus. The warning was clear, and it was motivated by genuine foresight. Prometheus knew Zeus. He understood how the king of the gods thought, and he knew that a gift from Zeus in the aftermath of the fire theft was not likely to be a genuine act of generosity. He told Epimetheus to refuse whatever Zeus sent, and to send it back without accepting it. Epimetheus heard the warning, and then Pandora arrived. His name means afterthought, and his response to Pandora illustrates perfectly why that name was given to him. He saw her, he desired her, he accepted her, and only afterward did he remember his brother's warning and understand what he had done. The story of Epimetheus is in many ways more interesting than the story of Pandora herself, because it is a story about the limits of rationality in the face of desire. Prometheus could see what was coming. Epimetheus could not, or would not, because what was standing in front of him was more immediately compelling than any future consequence his brother had described in the abstract. This is a pattern of human behavior that the Greeks recognized, and that every subsequent culture has recognized after them. The warning that arrives too early to be heeded, the advice that is understood in principle and ignored in practice, the decision made in the moment of desire whose consequences are only clear when the moment has passed. Epimetheus is not a villain in the myth. He is something more uncomfortable. He is recognizable. He is the part of human experience that knows better and acts otherwise. The part that listens to the warning and nods, and then does exactly what the warning said not to do, because the thing in front of it is beautiful, and the future consequences abstract, and beauty is immediate, and abstract consequences are not. Every human being who has ever known what they should do, and done something else instead, has something of Epimetheus in them. His acceptance of Pandora is not a failure of intelligence. It is a failure of the will to apply intelligence at precisely the moment when applying it would have mattered most. The jar, not the box, and how one mistranslation changed the story forever. Here is one of the most interesting facts about the myth of Pandora, and one that changes the way the story feels once you know it. Pandora did not have a box. She had a jar. The original Greek word in Hesiod's text, the earliest surviving source for the myth, is pithos. A pithos was a large storage jar of the kind used throughout the ancient Greek world to store grain, olive oil, wine, and other provisions. These jars were large enough to contain a person and were sometimes used as burial containers. They were ubiquitous in ancient Greek households, and their presence in the myth was entirely natural and practical. A pithos was where you kept things. It was where the household's provisions were stored. The idea that something dangerous and overwhelming might be kept in a storage jar made perfect sense in the context of the everyday Greek life in which the story was told. The mistranslation from jar to box occurred in the 16th century when the Dutch humanist Erasmus was writing a collection of adages and proverbs and encountered a passage in the ancient author Babrius that referenced the Pandora story. Erasmus rendered the Greek pithos as the Latin piscis, which means a small box or container, and the image of a small portable box that could be held in the hands and opened with a lid proved so much more visually compelling than a large storage jar that the mistranslation stuck. By the time later artists and writers were working with the myth, the box had replaced the jar so completely that most people today would be surprised to learn that a jar was ever involved. The change from jar to box matters because it changes the nature of the act of opening. A pithos is a household storage container. Opening it is a domestic act, a routine gesture, the kind of thing you do when you need something from the stores. A box, particularly the kind of ornate and mysterious box that artists from the Renaissance onward depicted Pandora holding, is something more actively forbidden, more deliberately dangerous, more clearly a thing that should not be opened. The box implies a specific prohibition and a specific act of transgression. The jar implies something more ambiguous, more everyday, more domestic in its danger. The mistranslation made Pandora's act seem more deliberate and perhaps more blameworthy than the original story quite intended. What was inside the jar, and how it escaped into the world? Hesiod, writing in the 7th or 8th century before the Common Era, describes the contents of the jar with a vividness that has shaped every subsequent telling. Inside the jar were all the evils, diseases, and hardships that afflict human beings. Before Pandora opened it, these things did not exist in the human world. Human beings were spared from them by the same divine protection that kept the Golden Age free from suffering. The moment Pandora lifted the lid, everything that had been confined within the jar escaped into the world and dispersed across the earth before she could close it again. Disease in all its forms, old age and its slow erosion of the body, toil and labor and the necessity of effort, grief and sorrow, and all the emotional suffering that human beings experience in their relationships and in their own minds. The death of children, the failure of harvests, the destruction of ships and the losses of war. Everything that makes human life hard and painful and finite was contained in that jar and released into the world in the moment of Pandora's curiosity. Hesiod does not describe the individual evils in precise detail. He gives us the category rather than the inventory. The list is open-ended, which is itself significant. The evils that escaped from the jar are not a finite enumeration. They are everything that falls under the category of human suffering, which is to say everything that the human experience contains that makes it different from the divine experience of immortal beings who do not age or suffer or die. The image of the evils escaping from the jar like a swarm is one of the most powerful in Greek mythology, because it captures the nature of suffering so precisely. Suffering does not arrive in one form and stay in one place. It disperses, it spreads, it multiplies and takes new forms and shows up in places and at moments when you are not prepared for it. The swarm that left the jar was not a fixed and finite set of miseries. It was the principle of misery itself, released into the world in all its variety and unpredictability. And once it was out, it could not be put back. That is the most important thing about the myth of Pandora, and the thing that gives the phrase Pandora's box its meaning in every language that uses it. Once opened, it cannot be closed again. The thing that has been released does not go back in the jar. Hope at the bottom and why it stayed inside. Here is where the myth becomes its most strange and most beautiful. When Pandora closed the jar again, just barely in time to prevent the last thing from escaping, what remained inside was Elpis. Hope, only hope, remained inside the jar when everything else had escaped into the world. This detail is one of the most discussed and most debated in all of Greek mythology, because it seems, on first encounter, almost impossibly puzzling. Why was hope in a jar, with diseases and sorrows and suffering? If hope is a good thing, why was it contained alongside the evils? If it is a good thing, why does it staying inside the jar seem like it might be a further deprivation rather than a consolation? The scholars and philosophers who have thought about this question across centuries have arrived at very different answers. The most common interpretation is the consolatory one. Hope remained in the jar so that human beings would still have it after all the other evils had been released. On this reading, hope was placed in the jar alongside the evils, precisely so that it would be protected when the evils escaped, remaining behind as the one resource that human beings retain in the face of all the suffering that Pandora's opening of the jar released. Hope is what keeps human beings going in the face of disease and toil and grief and death. And hope survived the opening of the jar because Pandora closed it just in time. This is a beautiful and comforting reading, and it is the one that most people carry with them when they think about the myth. But there are other readings that are less comforting and perhaps more interesting. Some ancient commentators suggested that hope was in the jar with the evils because hope is itself ambiguous. Hope can sustain us, but it can also deceive us. It can keep us going through genuine difficulties, but it can also keep us attached to outcomes that will not come, and in that attachment cause us a specific kind of suffering that we would have been spared if we had simply accepted reality. On this reading, hope is in the jar with the evils because hope is itself a kind of evil, or at least a kind of danger, and its remaining in the jar is not a consolation but an additional confinement, a restraint on an ambiguous force that might help human beings or might harm them depending on the circumstances and the object of the hope. The ancient philosopher Nietzsche, writing 2.5 millennia after Hesiod, took the darkest reading of all. He suggested that hope remained in the jar because hope is the greatest evil of all, the thing that prolongs human suffering by keeping people attached to the possibility of relief instead of accepting the reality of their situation. On this reading, Zeus kept hope inside the jar, not as a kindness to humanity, but as the cruelest part of the punishment. Not the suffering alone, but the hope that the suffering might end, which ensures that the suffering is never fully accepted and therefore never fully transcended. The myth of Pandora does not tell us which of these readings is correct. It offers the detail and leaves the interpretation open. And that openness is part of what makes it one of the greatest stories ever told. Hesiod, the primary source, and what he was really trying to say. The story of Pandora, as we know it, it comes primarily from 2 works by the ancient Greek poet Hesiod, who is believed to have lived around the 7th or 8th century before the Common Era, making him one of the earliest Greek poets whose work survives. The 2 works are the Theogony, which means the birth of the gods, and Works and Days, which is a long poem addressed to Hesiod's brother Perseus about the nature of justice and the importance of honest labour. In the Theogony, Hesiod gives the first account of Pandora's creation, describing how Zeus ordered Hephaestus to make her and how each god contributed to her making. In Works and Days, he gives a fuller account that includes the jar and its contents and hope at the bottom, and the consequences for humanity of what Pandora did. Hesiod was not simply telling a story for entertainment. He was making arguments. Works and Days is a didactic poem, a poem with a purpose, and that purpose was to explain to his audience why life is hard and why honesty and labour are the only appropriate responses to that hardness. The myth of Pandora served this purpose by explaining why the easy abundance of the Golden Age is gone and why human beings must now work for their survival. It gave the difficulty of agricultural life in archaic Greece a narrative explanation that was simultaneously theological, attributing the difficulty to divine decision, and moral, suggesting that the difficulty was in some sense earned by the actions of Prometheus and by the curiosity of Pandora. Hesiod's attitude toward women in the Pandora myth is one of the most discussed and most criticized aspects of his work. He presents women in general as a race apart from men, created by Zeus as a beautiful evil, a punishment disguised as a gift. This attitude reflects the gender politics of archaic Greek society in ways that make modern readers uncomfortable and that have generated considerable scholarly debate about how to read these passages responsibly without either ignoring their cultural context or uncritically reproducing their misogynistic content. What is important to understand is that Hesiod's presentation of Pandora is not the only Greek presentation of Pandora, and that the myth was told in other forms that gave Pandora a very different character and a very different meaning. Hesiod's version is the one that survived most completely, and therefore the one that shaped subsequent tradition most powerfully. But it was never the only version, and the myth's richness comes partly from the fact that it was never entirely contained within any single telling. The different versions of the Pandora story in the ancient world. The version of the Pandora myth that most people know is Hesiod's version. But the ancient world was not a world with a single authoritative text for each myth it told. Greek mythology was a living oral tradition that existed in many versions simultaneously and that changed as it traveled across regions and centuries. There were other versions of the Pandora story in circulation that differed from Hesiod's in significant ways. In some versions, Pandora is not the first woman, but simply the first woman to open the jar. In others, the jar was not Pandora's at all, but was brought to the household by Epimetheus, and Pandora simply encountered it there. In still others, the jar contained not only evils, but goods as well, blessings that escaped along with the curses, and that are now distributed across the world in the same scattered, unpredictable way as the sufferings. This version gives the myth a different emotional quality. It suggests that the world is not simply worse than it was, but differently organized, its goods and its evils scattered and intermixed in a way that requires human beings to seek out the goods rather than simply receiving them as they did in the Golden Age. There is also a tradition, mentioned by some ancient scholars, of a Pandora who was understood not as the first mortal woman, but as an earth goddess, a chthonic deity associated with the abundance of the earth. In this tradition, Pandora was the all-giver, not the punished opener of the jar, but the divine feminine principle from which all life emerged. Some scholars have argued that this older tradition is visible beneath the surface of Hesiod's telling in the name Pandora itself, and in certain details of the narrative that make more sense in the context of a goddess myth than in the context of a punishment story. The plurality of versions is not a problem with the myth. It is a feature of how myths work. A myth that exists in only one form is a myth that has stopped living. The Pandora myth has been alive for nearly 3,000 years, precisely because it has been told in different ways by different people, for different purposes, in different cultural contexts. Each telling adds something and loses something, and the total of all the tellings together is richer than any single version could be. Pandora and Eve, two stories of human suffering with a woman at the center. The myth of Pandora and the story of Eve from the book of Genesis are the two most famous origin stories of human suffering in Western civilization, and the parallels between them are so striking that scholars have been discussing their relationship for centuries. Both stories involve a woman who performs an act that introduces suffering into a world that previously lacked it. Both stories involve a forbidden thing, a jar in one case and a fruit in the other, that the woman is instructed not to approach. and that she approaches anyway out of curiosity or desire. Both stories result in the loss of a paradise, the Golden Age in the Greek case, and the Garden of Eden in the Hebrew case, and the beginning of the hard work and suffering that characterize ordinary human life. Both stories have been used across centuries to justify negative attitudes toward women by presenting female curiosity or disobedience as the cause of collective human suffering. The parallels are close enough that many scholars have proposed a common origin for both stories in the ancient Near Eastern mythological tradition from which both Greek and Hebrew culture drew. The story of Adapa, an ancient Mesopotamian myth in which a man is offered food that would grant him immortality and fails to eat it because he has been warned against it, shares structural elements with both the Pandora myth and the Eden story, in ways that suggest all three may have evolved from an earlier shared template. But the differences between Pandora and Eve are as instructive as the similarities. Eve is given a specific command by a personal god, and her disobedience is a transgression against that specific divine authority. Pandora's curiosity is not presented as disobedience in the same way. She was not told not to open the jar in Hesiod's account. Or, if she was told, the telling is not preserved in the surviving text. Her act is described as happening, but not as being a specific violation of a specific prohibition in the way that Eve's eating of the fruit is. This difference makes the moral weight of the two acts different. Eve's act is explicitly a sin, a violation of divine law. Pandora's act is more ambiguous, more like an accident of curiosity than a deliberate transgression, which makes her a more complicated figure and the myth a more complicated moral document. The myth in art and how painters and sculptors have imagined Pandora across the centuries. The story of Pandora has attracted artists since antiquity and has produced some of the most striking and most debated images in the history of Western art. Ancient Greek pottery frequently depicted scenes from mythology, and while surviving images of Pandora are relatively rare compared with depictions of other mythological subjects, the few that exist are revealing about how the ancient Greeks visualized the story. On a famous red figure crater in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, Pandora is shown being raised from the earth, surrounded by gods and satyrs, in a composition that suggests the earth goddess tradition rather than the punishment narrative of Hesiod. Renaissance artists approached the subject with the conventions of their own time, depicting Pandora as a beautiful woman holding or standing near an elaborately decorated box, or urn in compositions that drew on classical models but reflected the aesthetic values of their own era. It was the Victorian period, however, that produced the most numerous and most famous painted images of Pandora, in a wave of interest in classical mythology that swept through British and European art in the second half of the 19th century. The pre-Raphaelite painters and their successors found in Pandora a subject that combined classical authority with the themes of feminine beauty and feminine danger that preoccupied Victorian culture. Dante Gabriel Rossetti's painting of Pandora, completed in multiple versions in the 1870s, shows a figure of overwhelming physical beauty, holding a golden casket from which a thin wisp of smoke escapes. Her expression is complicated, neither innocent nor guilty, but somewhere between the two in a way that captures the ambiguity of the myth itself. Rossetti used his lover Jane Morris as the model for Pandora, in a casting choice that added personal and biographical complexity to the already rich mythological subject. John William Waterhouse and the Victorian obsession with Pandora. Among the Victorian artists who painted Pandora, John William Waterhouse produced two works that are among the most widely reproduced images of the subject in any period. Waterhouse was a painter of extraordinary technical skill who specialized in mythological and literary subjects and who brought to them a combination of academic precision and emotional warmth that made his paintings immediately accessible to audiences who might not be deeply familiar with the stories they depicted. His first Pandora, painted in 1896, shows a young woman kneeling in a sunlit landscape, leaning over the open jar with an expression of concentrated curiosity. The moment depicted is the moment just before the opening, or perhaps the moment of the opening itself, when the consequences of the act are not yet visible, and the figure is absorbed entirely in the act of looking. There is something deeply sympathetic in Waterhouse's Pandora. She does not look like a punishment or a curse. She looks like someone who wants to know what is inside, and wanting to know what is inside is not presented as a moral failing, but as a deeply human impulse that the viewer is invited to share. The Victorian fascination with Pandora was not simply aesthetic. It reflected a genuine cultural anxiety about female curiosity and female agency that the Pandora myth expressed in mythological form. Victorian society placed enormous restrictions on the intellectual and social freedom of women, and the myth of the curious woman whose curiosity caused disaster was one that spoke directly to those restrictions. But it spoke in a double register. At the same time that the myth could be used to justify restricting female curiosity, the paintings that depicted Pandora with sympathy and beauty made the curious woman a figure of power and attraction, rather than simply one of danger and blame. The Victorian Pandora was both warning and invitation, which is perhaps why the subject attracted so many Victorian painters, and why so many of their paintings of her are among the most beautiful images of the period. What the myth says about curiosity, and whether it is a virtue or a vice. One of the deepest questions the Pandora myth raises is the question of curiosity. Is curiosity good or bad? Is the desire to know what is inside the jar a positive quality of the inquiring mind, or a dangerous impulse that leads to disaster? The myth has been used throughout Western history to support both answers to this question. In the reading that emphasizes Pandora's transgression, curiosity is a vice, a failure of self-control that leads to the release of suffering into the world. You were told not to open it. You opened it anyway. The desire to know was stronger than the will to restrain that desire, and the consequences were catastrophic. In this reading, curiosity is associated with disobedience and with female weakness, and the lesson of the myth is that some things are better left unknown. But there is another reading that has become increasingly prominent in modern interpretations of the myth, and that finds in Pandora's curiosity not a vice, but a necessity. Without the opening of the jar, the world would have remained sealed and static. The evils would have been confined, but human beings would also have remained in a state of ignorance about the full reality of their situation. The opening of the jar, on this reading, is the beginning of knowledge. It is the moment at which human beings become fully conscious of the world they actually inhabit, rather than the protected and partial world that the gods had maintained for them. Curiosity, in this reading, is the engine of human progress. It is what drives the inquiring mind to look into the jar, to sail beyond the edge of the known sea, to ask questions whose answers might be uncomfortable, but that are necessary to ask if human beings are to understand their world. The myth of Pandora has been told for 3,000 years, and the question of whether its central act is transgression or discovery has never been definitively settled. Perhaps it does not need to be. Perhaps the myth is most valuable precisely because it holds both possibilities simultaneously and leaves the question of which reading is correct to the person who is encountering the story and their own relationship with the impulse to open the jar. The myth of Pandora and what it says about women and the complicated history of that reading. It would be dishonest to discuss the myth of Pandora without acknowledging directly the way it has been used across centuries to justify negative attitudes toward women. Hesiod's presentation of Pandora as a beautiful evil, a punishment disguised as a gift, the originating source of human suffering, was the foundation on which a long tradition of misogynistic reading was built. If a woman was the cause of all suffering, if female curiosity was the mechanism by which the Golden Age was lost, then the subordination of women, their exclusion from positions of authority and knowledge, their confinement to the domestic sphere, could all be justified by reference to the story of what happened the last time a woman was given access to something important. This reading of the myth has been used in various forms across 2,500 years of Western history, and its influence on the cultural and legal status of women has been real and significant, and largely harmful. But the myth is also bigger than this reading. Pandora is not only a source of suffering, she is also the vessel that contains hope. She is the figure whose name means all giving, as well as all gifted. She is the creation of the most skilled and the most wise and the most beautiful of the Olympian gods. And what they put into her was not only deception, but beauty and skill and grace. The modern reading of Pandora that has become most influential in feminist scholarship and popular culture reclaims her as a figure of agency and power rather than of transgression and blame. On this reading, Pandora is not the cause of human suffering, but the first fully human being, the first creature who possesses both the desire to know and the capacity to act on that desire, and whose action, whatever its consequences, is the founding act of human self-determination. She opened the jar because she wanted to know what was inside, and that wanting to know is not a flaw in her character. It is the most essentially human thing about her. Modern interpretations of the myth and the phrase Pandora's box in everyday life. The myth of Pandora lives in the modern world, not only in the retellings and the paintings and the scholarly debates, but in the language itself. The phrase Pandora's box is used in English and in the equivalent phrases in dozens of other languages to describe any action that releases consequences too numerous and too complex to contain or reverse. We open a Pandora's box when we make a decision whose consequences we have not fully anticipated, and that cannot be undone once made. A piece of legislation that creates unexpected social effects, a technological development that produces unforeseen problems alongside its benefits, a diplomatic intervention that destabilizes a region in ways that the intervening parties did not predict, a personal conversation that reveals truths that change a relationship in ways that cannot be taken back. All of these are described as opening Pandora's box, and in each case the phrase carries within it the full weight of the ancient myth. The irreversibility, the dispersal of consequences that cannot be recalled, the gap between the moment of opening and the full understanding of what was released, the persistence in everyday language of a metaphor drawn from a 3,000-year-old Greek myth is itself evidence of how deeply the story has entered the imaginative foundations of Western culture. We use the phrase without thinking about its origin, because the origin has been absorbed so completely into the way we think about actions and consequences that the mythological source no longer needs to be invoked explicitly. The myth has become a way of thinking. The name Pandora, has also entered the modern world in other forms. The music streaming service Pandora Radio takes its name from the myth with a deliberate appropriateness. A service that releases music into the world in streams that cannot be entirely controlled or predicted is named for the woman who released the contents of the jar. The Pandora jewelry brand, by contrast, takes from the myth only the idea of a beautiful box of gifts, which is perhaps the most optimistic possible reading of a myth whose central container holds suffering and hope in equal measure. What hope means in the context of the myth and why it matters now. We come at last to hope. Elpis, the thing that remained in the jar, the thing that survived when everything else had escaped. Whatever reading of the myth we prefer, whatever we think Hesiod intended by placing hope in the jar alongside the evils, hope is what the myth leaves us with at the end. It is the last image of the story. The jar closed, the evils dispersed across the world, and hope remaining inside in a space that is now its own, the only occupant of a container that was previously full of darkness. What does it mean that hope is what remained? In the most straightforward reading, it means that human beings are not left entirely without resource in the face of the suffering the jar released. We have hope, not certainty, not protection, not the return of the golden age, but hope, the orientation toward a possible future that is better than the present, the capacity to believe that things might improve even when the evidence for improvement is limited, the willingness to continue in the face of suffering because the future has not yet arrived, and the future might be different from now. Hope is not a guarantee. The myth is very clear about that. The golden age is gone. The evils are in the world. Disease and old age and toil and grief are real, and they are not going to be taken back. But hope remains, and the fact that it remains, the fact that it was in the jar with everything else, and was the only thing that did not escape, gives it a quality that the other contents of the jar do not have. The evils are dispersed and scattered and beyond recall. Hope is contained. Hope is here. Hope is available. Not in the sense of being guaranteed, but in the sense of being possible. The myth of Pandora has been with us for nearly 3,000 years, and it has survived because it addresses something that human beings in every culture and every era have needed to address: the fact that the world contains suffering, and the question of how to live in a world that contains it. The answer the myth offers is not a simple one. It does not say that suffering can be avoided or eliminated. It does not say that the golden age will return. It says that in the same jar as everything that is hard about being human there is also hope, and that hope, whatever its precise nature, whatever its relationship to the suffering alongside which it sat, is what remains available to us when everything else has been released into the world and cannot be called back. That is the gift the myth offers. Not comfort, not reassurance, not the promise that things will be all right, but the possibility, the always remaining possibility that has been with human beings since the beginning, and that no amount of suffering has yet managed to exhaust. The myth as an explanation for why the world contains suffering. Every culture in the history of the world has needed to explain why the world contains suffering. This is not a peculiarly Greek problem. It is not a peculiarly ancient problem. It is one of the most persistent and most urgent questions that human consciousness generates simply by being conscious of the world it inhabits. The world contains beautiful things and terrible things. It contains love and grief and health and sickness and laughter and loss, and the question of why it contains both. Why a world that contains so much that is good also contains so much that is painful has generated religious and philosophical responses in every culture that has ever reflected on its own experience. The Pandora myth is one of the oldest surviving answers to this question, and it is one that has the virtue of emotional honesty. It does not pretend that suffering has a simple purpose, or that it is secretly good for us, or that it will eventually be redeemed. It says that suffering is real, that it entered the world at a specific moment through a specific act, that it cannot be reversed, and that what we have in the face of it is hope. This is a more honest answer than many that have been offered by later philosophical and religious traditions that have tried to explain suffering as ultimately purposeful or ultimately good. The Greek answer is simpler and in some ways darker. Suffering is not good. It does not have a purpose. It was released into the world, and it cannot be recalled. But hope is also in the world, and hope is real. The myth of Pandora gives us the world as it is, without flinching from the hardness of that reality, and without pretending to offer more comfort than it actually can. In that honesty lies its enduring power. It has been told for 3,000 years, because it tells the truth about something that human beings have needed the truth about for as long as they have been able to ask the question, why is the world like this? And the answer the myth gives is not why, but what. This is what the world is. This is what it contains. And this is what remains. The story of Prometheus revisited and how it connects to Pandora. The myth of Pandora cannot be fully understood without the myth of Prometheus that precedes it. Prometheus stole fire and gave humanity civilization. Zeus punished Prometheus and then created Pandora to ensure that civilization came with a cost. The two myths are two halves of the same story about the relationship between the human and the divine, and about what it costs to be human rather than divine. Prometheus gave humanity the tools to build. Pandora brought into the world the suffering that makes building necessary. Without the tools, there is nothing to build with. Without the suffering, there is no urgency to build. The two gifts together, fire and the jar, constitute the complete human condition. The capacity to create and the necessity to suffer. The ability to make things better and the inevitability of things going wrong. Prometheus saw what was coming and acted anyway. Pandora acted and then saw what had come. Between them, forethought and afterthought, they bracket the entirety of human experience in a way that is both intellectually precise and emotionally true. The myth of Prometheus has its own legacy in Western culture, most famously in the Romantic tradition, where Prometheus became a figure of heroic rebellion against divine authority. The revolutionary who defied the gods in the service of humanity and suffered for it with unbreakable dignity. Mary Shelley subtitled her novel Frankenstein the Modern Prometheus in a recognition that the story of a creator whose creation escapes his control and produces consequences he did not intend is a version of the Prometheus myth updated for the age of scientific ambition. Pandora and Frankenstein's monster are related figures in the Western imagination, both created beings whose existence produces suffering, both figures in whose story the question of who is responsible for that suffering is never entirely resolved. The creator or the created, the one who made the thing or the thing itself. The myth does not answer. The question is left open, as the best questions always are. The legacy of the Pandora myth and what it leaves us with. The myth of Pandora is nearly 3,000 years old, and it is still being told, still being painted and filmed and written about and argued over and referenced in everyday speech by people who do not know its source. That longevity is not accidental. It reflects something about the quality of the story itself, its capacity to speak to something permanent in human experience, in a form that survives the enormous changes in culture and circumstance that 3,000 years inevitably brings. The world has changed almost beyond recognition since Hesiod wrote, "The gods of Olympus are no longer worshipped." The agricultural society that gave the myth its everyday texture is largely gone. The gender politics that shaped Hesiod's telling have been comprehensively challenged and in many respects transformed. And yet, the myth remains. It remains because its core questions are permanent. Why does the world contain suffering? What is the relationship between curiosity and consequence? What does it mean to act without fully understanding what your action will release? And what do we have? What do we retain? What remains available to us when the worst has been released into the world and cannot be recalled? The answer to the last question is hope. Elpis, the thing at the bottom of the jar, the thing that was there alongside all the darkness, and that remained when the darkness escaped. Not because it is stronger than the darkness, not because it cancels the darkness or redeems it, but because it is there, still there. After everything, still inside, still available. The myth of Pandora is not a comfortable story. It does not promise that everything will be all right. It does not pretend that suffering has a purpose. It does not offer the consolation of a happy ending. What it offers instead is the truth of the human situation, held in a form beautiful enough to survive 3,000 years, and honest enough to still feel true to anyone who encounters it tonight, in whatever darkness or difficulty or ordinary complexity their life currently contains. The jar was opened. The evils escaped. Hope remained. That is the story. That has always been the story, and it is enough. And so we come gently to the end of our journey through the myth of Pandora. We have stood in the golden age and felt its ease. We have watched Prometheus climb to the fire of the gods and carry it down in a fennel stalk to a humanity that was cold and unprotected. We have watched Zeus's anger become creative, transforming punishment into the most beautiful thing he could devise. We have stood in the workshop of Hephaestus and watched the gods queue to give their gifts to a being who did not yet exist, but who would carry their gifts into the world alongside a jar full of everything difficult about being human. We have watched Epimetheus see her and forget his brother's warning in the most recognizable and most human of failures. We have argued about whether the jar held a box and decided it held a jar, and that the jar is more interesting anyway. We have opened it with Pandora and watched what escaped, and closed it just in time to keep hope inside. We have argued about what hope means in a jar with diseases and sorrows, and decided that the argument itself is part of the gift. We have compared Pandora with Eve and found them both more complicated than the traditions that blame them have allowed. We have looked at the paintings and found sympathy where we expected condemnation. We have traced the phrase Pandora's box through the languages that still carry it every day without knowing where it came from. And we have ended where the myth ends, with hope, not because hope is guaranteed and not because suffering is over, but because hope is there, because it was in the jar and it stayed in the jar, and the jar is still here, and so are we. If this quiet journey through the ancient world brought you some peace tonight, I would love it if you liked or subscribed or simply left a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. And if there is still some wakefulness left in you, there should be another calm history waiting on the screen for you now. But for this moment, there is nothing more to follow. Let the golden age rest in its memory. Let the jar sit quietly in the dark. Let your breathing become slow and even and easy. Hope is still inside. It has always been inside. And tonight, wherever you are, and whatever the jar of your own life contains, hope is still there at the bottom. Sleep well. Good night. The 5 ages of humanity in Hesiod, and where Pandora fits within them. Hesiod did not simply tell the story of Pandora in isolation. He placed it within a larger narrative about the history of humanity that he called the myth of the 5 ages, or sometimes the 5 races of human beings. In this framework, human history is not a story of progress, but a story of decline, a gradual falling away from an original state of perfection toward the increasingly difficult conditions of the present. The first age was the Golden Age, already discussed, the era of ease and abundance when human beings lived like gods. The second was the Silver Age, a period less perfect than the first, in which human beings spent 100 years as children, but then aged quickly and lived short and troubled adult lives, failing to worship the gods properly and eventually being destroyed by Zeus for their impiety. The third was the Bronze Age, a harder and more violent era in which human beings were made of bronze and cared only for war and the works of Ares. They destroyed themselves through violence and descended into the underworld without glory. The Fourth Age was the Age of Heroes, the only one of the 5 ages that does not show a straightforward decline. This was the age of the great heroes of Greek mythology, Achilles and Heracles and Perseus and the rest, who are presented as more noble and more glorious than the bronze men who preceded them. After death, they were sent to the Isles of the Blessed, a paradise beyond the normal reach of the dead, where they lived in eternal happiness. The Fifth Age is the age that Hesiod himself inhabits, the Iron Age, the present age, the age we are all in which life is hard and just men suffer while the unjust often prosper. The gods have withdrawn from the earth. Shame and justice, personified as divine beings, have abandoned human society and gone to live among the gods on Olympus. Work is necessary, suffering is constant, and the trend is continuing downward. Hesiod does not offer hope for an improvement of the Iron Age. He describes it as a period in which things will continue to get worse until Zeus destroys this race of human beings as he destroyed the others. Within this framework, the myth of Pandora functions as the explanation for the transition from the Golden Age to all that followed. The opening of the jar is the moment when the Iron Age begins, or rather, when the possibility of the Iron Age becomes inevitable. Pandora does not simply release suffering into the world. She closes the door on the Golden Age and opens the era in which human beings must work and suffer and hope and make of those 3 things whatever life they can. The afterlife of Pandora in literature, from antiquity to the present. The Pandora myth has generated literary responses in every period of Western history, from the ancient world to the present day. In antiquity, the myth was referenced and reinterpreted by poets, philosophers, and dramatists in ways that reflect the different purposes to which it was put in different cultural and intellectual contexts. The playwright Sophocles wrote a satyr play called Pandora, now lost, that may have treated the myth in the comic mode appropriate to that genre. The philosopher Plato referenced the myth in several of his dialogues in ways that reflect his interest in the questions of human nature and the relationship between knowledge and suffering that the myth raises. In the Renaissance, the myth attracted the attention of humanist scholars who read it allegorically, interpreting Pandora's jar as a symbol of human desire, or of the soul's imprisonment in the body, or of the ambiguity of all earthly goods. The 16th century writer Erasmus, whose mistranslation of Pythos as Pyxis created the box that has dominated the tradition ever since, used the story in his Adagies as an example of the dangers of acting without thinking through consequences. In the Romantic period, the myth attracted poets who were drawn to its themes of rebellion, creation, and consequence. The connection between Prometheus and Pandora, between the creator who defies authority and the creation who changes the world, resonated deeply with romantic themes of individualism and revolution. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the myth has been retold in forms ranging from children's books to feminist theory to science fiction, each retelling reflecting the cultural concerns of its own moment while drawing on the enduring power of the original. The novelist Nikos Kazantzakis, author of Zorba the Greek, wrote a long poem called The Odyssey, a modern sequel, that includes a retelling of the Pandora myth, in which hope is reinterpreted as the most dangerous of all the jar's contents, because it is the thing that prevents human beings from accepting reality. The Canadian novelist Margaret Atwood has returned to the myth multiple times in her work, most explicitly in her essay Unpacking My Library, where she reflects on the relationship between containers and their contents, and on the act of opening as a form of both discovery and release. The myth keeps generating responses because it keeps raising questions that the generations who encounter it cannot leave unanswered and cannot answer definitively. That is the measure of its quality. A myth that can be definitively answered is a myth that has served its purpose and can be retired. The myth of Pandora has not been retired and shows no sign of being so. The psychological dimensions of the Pandora myth and what it says about the human mind. Beyond its theological and social dimensions, the myth of Pandora speaks directly to the psychology of human experience in ways that have made it valuable to modern thinkers working in very different traditions from the ancient Greeks. The act of opening a container you have been warned not to open is one of the most universally recognizable descriptions of a specific human psychological dynamic. The warning itself creates the desire. Before the jar was pointed out and prohibited, Pandora may not have thought much about what was inside. The prohibition creates the curiosity it is designed to prevent. This is a pattern that psychologists recognize as the ironic process theory of mental control. The observation that trying not to think about something often makes you think about it more. The forbidden jar is more compelling than an ordinary jar, precisely because it is forbidden. The mythological formulation of this dynamic predates the psychological one by 3,000 years, which suggests that the ancient Greeks were observing something real about the way the human mind responds to prohibition. The Jungian tradition in psychology has also found in the Pandora myth a rich source of archetypal material. The jar as a symbol of the unconscious, the evils as the shadow content of the psyche, the repressed and denied aspects of human experience that cannot be kept sealed indefinitely. Hope as the self, the organizing principle of the personality that remains available even when the shadow has been fully encountered. In this reading, the opening of the jar is not a disaster, but a necessary process. The encounter with the full reality of human experience that is a precondition for genuine psychological maturity. You cannot have hope in any meaningful sense without having looked into the jar and seen what is there. Hope that has not encountered the reality of suffering is not hope, but naivety. The hope that remains in the jar after everything else has escaped is a hope that has been in the presence of all the darkness and remained anyway. That is a different and a stronger thing than hope that has never been tested. The role of the gods in the Pandora myth and what it says about divine justice. The gods in the Pandora myth are not straightforwardly good. Zeus creates Pandora as a punishment. The other gods contribute to her making with gifts that are double-edged at best and deliberately harmful at worst. Hermes gives her a lying tongue. Aphrodite gives her a beauty designed to make men desire her for purposes that are not in their long-term interest. The whole creation is a trap, an act of divine ingenuity applied to the project of human suffering with a precision and a thoroughness that is genuinely troubling when you look at it directly. The gods of Greek mythology are not the moral paragons that later monotheistic traditions tended to require of their deities. They are powerful, capricious, sometimes petty, sometimes generous, capable of great beauty and great cruelty, and entirely capable of using their power to satisfy desires and settle grievances in ways that cause enormous suffering to the mortals caught in their path. Zeus's treatment of Prometheus is one of the most brutal acts in all of Greek mythology. His creation of Pandora as a secondary punishment aimed at all of humanity for the act of one titan who was trying to help them reveals a divine justice that operates on terms very different from the ones that seem fair from a human perspective. The ancient Greeks did not worship Zeus because he was good. They worshipped him because he was powerful, and because power in the ancient world required acknowledgement regardless of whether it was exercised justly. The Pandora myth is in part a myth about power and about what happens when power is exercised without accountability. Zeus can create a Pandora because he is Zeus. There is no higher authority to whom the victims of his punishment can appeal. Human beings can suffer from his decision, and the only resource they have in the face of that suffering is the same resource that remained in the jar when everything else escaped. Hope, not justice, not redress, not the reversal of the punishment, just hope. The Greek theological world was not a world that promised justice. It was a world that offered hope. And perhaps that is more honest than the alternatives. The animals in the Pandora story and what they tell us about the world before the jar was opened. One detail of the Pandora myth that is easy to overlook is the role of the animal kingdom in the story of Epimetheus and the distribution of qualities. When Epimetheus went through the creatures of the earth, giving each its gifts, he gave the swift their speed and the strong their strength, the armored their shells and the small their ability to hide. He gave the predators their claws and the prey their speed or their numbers. He distributed the gifts of survival with a generosity that left him nothing for humanity when he finally reached us. This detail is significant because it places the creation of human civilization not as a given, but as a necessity born of deprivation. Human beings do not have speed or strength or armor or claws. They are the animal that was created last, the animal that arrived when all the good gifts were already taken, and that survived not through any natural endowment, but through the stolen fire that Prometheus provided. The vulnerability of the human animal is the starting point of civilization. If Epimetheus had given humanity the gifts he gave other animals, if we had the speed of a cheetah or the strength of a bear, perhaps we would not have needed fire and the civilization it made possible. Perhaps we would have been like the other animals, well equipped for survival, but not for building and creating and imagining. The theft of fire, and with it the beginning of human civilization, was made necessary by a mistake, by Epimetheus running out of gifts before he reached us. The myth suggests that everything that makes us distinctively human, our technology, our culture, our civilization, our art, all of it emerges from an original deficit. From the fact that we were the last animal created and the most poorly equipped for survival in the natural world, that origin in deficit and necessity is itself a kind of creation myth, a story about how the least naturally gifted creature became the most powerful one on earth through the theft of something that did not belong to it, and the release of something that was better left contained. The human condition, on this reading, begins in a double act of transgression, the theft and the opening. And everything we have built since then has been built on those two original acts and what they set in motion. The myth of Pandora, in the context of ancient Greek religious practice. The myth of Pandora was not simply a story told for entertainment in the ancient Greek world. It was embedded in a religious culture in which the gods were real presences in daily life, and in which the relationship between human beings and the divine was a constant practical concern. The Greeks worshipped their gods through sacrifices, festivals, prayers, and rituals that were understood as maintaining the relationship between the human and the divine worlds, in a form that was beneficial to both parties. The gods needed to be honored and propitiated because their goodwill was necessary for human flourishing. Human beings needed to worship the gods because the gods were more powerful than they were, and their anger, as the myth of Prometheus demonstrates, could produce consequences of cosmic scale. The myth of Pandora functioned within this religious culture as an explanation for why the relationship between gods and humans had the character it did. The ease of the Golden Age had been replaced by the difficulty of the present age because of what had happened between Prometheus and Zeus, and because of what Pandora had released from the jar. The ongoing ritual relationship between humans and gods, the sacrifices and the festivals and the temples, was a way of managing a relationship that had been fundamentally altered by the events the myth described. Human beings could not undo what Pandora had done. They could not return to the Golden Age, but they could maintain their relationship with the gods in a form that prevented further deterioration and that might occasionally attract divine favor. Worship in ancient Greece was not primarily an expression of love for the gods or of gratitude for their goodness. It was a practical management of a relationship with beings more powerful than yourself, whose goodwill was useful and whose anger was dangerous. The myth of Pandora explained why that management was necessary and why human beings were in the position of needing to perform it rather than enjoying the uncomplicated divine companionship of the Golden Age. The jar had been opened, the relationship had been changed, and ritual was the ongoing human response to that change. The fire that Prometheus stole and its relationship to the contents of the jar. There is a reading of the Pandora myth that connects the fire that Prometheus stole and the contents of the jar that Pandora opened in a way that makes the two acts two sides of the same cosmic equation. Fire, in this reading, is not simply a material benefit, the ability to cook and to forge and to warm oneself. Fire is consciousness. Fire is the awareness that comes with civilization. Fire is the capacity to know that you are mortal, to understand the nature of your situation, to perceive the suffering that is present in the world. Before Prometheus gave fire to humanity, human beings lived like animals in a kind of benign unconsciousness. They suffered perhaps, but they did not know that they suffered in the reflective, self-aware way that fully conscious beings suffer. Prometheus gave them fire, and with it consciousness. Zeus then gave them Pandora and the jar, and with the jar, the full reality of what consciousness means. Suffering that is known is different from suffering that is merely experienced. The animal that is cold feels the cold, but does not know that coldness is a condition that could be named and addressed. The human being who is cold feels the cold and knows what cold is, and can build a fire to address it, and can also suffer from the knowledge that not every cold can be addressed by a fire. This reading makes fire and the jar not two separate events, but two aspects of a single transformation in the human condition. The theft of fire and the opening of the jar together constitute the beginning of human consciousness in its fullest sense, the awareness of both the power to change the world and the suffering that the world contains and cannot be changed. On this reading, Pandora does not undo what Prometheus gave. She completes it. The gift of fire without the contents of the jar would be a gift of power without the wisdom that power requires. The contents of the jar without the fire would be suffering without the capacity to respond to suffering. Together, they constitute the human condition in its entirety, the condition that makes human beings simultaneously the most powerful and the most vulnerable creatures on earth. The Pandora myth and the philosophy of suffering. The philosophical questions that the Pandora myth raises have occupied thinkers from the ancient world to the present day. Why does the world contain suffering? Is suffering meaningful or arbitrary? How should human beings respond to suffering? What is the relationship between suffering and hope? These questions were central to ancient Greek philosophy, and they remain central to philosophy today. The Stoic philosophers of the ancient world developed a response to suffering that drew on elements of the Pandora myth without explicitly referencing it. The Stoics argued that suffering is real, that the proper human response to suffering is to distinguish between what is within our control and what is not, and to direct our energies exclusively toward the former. The contents of the jar are not within our control. They have been released into the world, and they will affect us whether we like it or not. What is within our control is our response to them. The Stoic sage does not suffer less than other human beings, but suffers differently, meeting suffering with a rational equanimity that preserves the inner freedom of the self, even when the external circumstances are entirely outside that self's control. The Epicurean philosophers took a different approach, arguing that the proper response to the reality of suffering was to organize one's life in ways that minimized exposure to it and maximized the experience of simple pleasures. The jar has been opened, the Epicureans might say. Since we cannot close it, let us focus on what small goods are available to us and not torment ourselves with the pursuit of goods that are beyond our reach. The Platonic tradition offered yet another response, finding in the suffering of the material world evidence that the material world is not the ultimately real one, and that the soul's true home is the realm of pure forms where suffering does not exist. Each of these philosophical responses is in some sense a response to the world that the Pandora myth describes, a world that contains suffering that cannot be recalled or reversed, a world in which hope remains available but is not guaranteed. world in which human beings must find some way to live with the reality of what the jar contained, without being destroyed by it. The children of Pandora and Epimetheus, and what came next in the mythology. The myth does not end with the opening of the jar. In Greek mythology, Pandora and Epimetheus had a daughter named Pyrrha. Pyrrha married Deucalion, the son of Prometheus, and Deucalion and Pyrrha are the figures at the center of the Greek version of the flood myth. Zeus, angry at the corruption of humanity in the Iron Age, decided to destroy the human race with a great flood. Prometheus, who could foresee what was coming, warned his son Deucalion and told him to build a large chest in which he and Pyrrha could shelter from the flood. The flood came and covered the earth and destroyed all living things. Deucalion and Pyrrha floated in their chest for 9 days and 9 nights until the waters receded and they came to rest on the highest mountain. When they emerged, they consulted the oracle of Themis about how to repopulate the earth. The oracle told them to throw the bones of their mother over their shoulders. They were confused at first, until they interpreted the oracle as referring to the earth, the great mother, whose bones were the stones beneath their feet. They threw stones over their shoulders, and from the stones that Deucalion threw grew men, and from the stones that Pyrrha threw grew women, and from this second creation, the human race was repopulated. The connection between the Pandora story and the flood myth through the genealogy of Pyrrha and Deucalion is one of the richest and most discussed features of Greek mythology. It suggests that the opening of the jar was only the first step in a much longer story about the relationship between the divine and the human, and about the repeated cycles of creation and destruction through which the human race has been renewed. Pandora opened the jar. The world changed. Generations passed. The world was destroyed. And then it was made again from stones. The myth of Pandora is not the beginning of a story that ends badly. It is the beginning of a story that continues through flood and renewal and the long, difficult work of being human in a world that is neither paradise nor entirely without hope. The jar itself, and what kind of object it was in the ancient Greek world, the pithos that holds the contents of the Pandora myth, was a specific and familiar object in ancient Greek daily life, and understanding what it actually was changes the emotional texture of the myth in interesting ways. A pithos was a large ceramic storage jar, typically taller than a human being, used to store the basic provisions of a Greek household. Grain and olive oil and wine and dried fish and preserved olives were all kept in pithoi of various sizes in the storeroom of a Greek home. The largest pithoi were too heavy to move when full, and were often buried partially in the ground of the storeroom floor to keep their contents cool. The mouth of a pithos was sealed with a stopper or a lid that could be removed to access the contents and replaced to protect them. Pithoi were also used, as mentioned earlier, as burial containers. The dead in some periods and regions of the ancient Greek world were buried in large pithoi, placed in the ground with the body inside, making the storage jar simultaneously a container for life's provisions and a container for the dead. This dual function, the pithos as both larder and tomb, gives the object used in the Pandora myth a richness that the more familiar image of a decorative box does not have. The jar that Pandora opened was not a precious object, not a treasure chest, or a reliquary, or a gift box. It was a domestic storage vessel, the kind of thing found in every Greek household. This domesticity is part of the myth's power. The source of all human suffering was not locked away in a special place or protected by extraordinary means. It was sitting in the household stores, looking like the jar that held the grain or the oil or the wine, the most dangerous thing in the world, was kept in the most ordinary possible container, and it was opened not through a dramatic act of transgression, but through the same everyday curiosity that makes you lift a lid to see what is inside. The gift of each Olympian god to Pandora, and what those gifts meant in practice. The gifts that the Olympian gods gave to Pandora deserve more careful attention than they sometimes receive in retellings of the myth. Each gift is specific to the domain of the god who gave it, and each carries within it the double edge that characterizes the entire project of Pandora's creation. Hephaestus, the divine craftsman, gave her physical form. He shaped her from clay and water as a potter shapes a vessel, and in doing so made her the most beautiful physical being that had ever existed in the mortal world. But Hephaestus himself was married to Aphrodite and knew better than most gods what the combination of beauty and desire could produce. His gift of physical form was genuine craftsmanship applied to a punitive purpose. Athena, goddess of wisdom and weaving and warfare, dressed Pandora in silver robes and taught her the domestic arts. Athena was a goddess who had remained a virgin and who was associated with the rational and the strategic rather than the emotional and the domestic. Her contribution to Pandora was the surface of civilization, the appearance of order and skill within which the more dangerous gifts of the other gods were concealed. Aphrodite poured grace and desire over Pandora, the capacity to make others want her without necessarily giving them what they wanted. Desire in Greek mythology is almost always a dangerous force. Aphrodite's gift is beautiful, and it creates beauty, but it also creates the blindness that desire produces. The inability to see clearly that is the immediate consequence of wanting something with the intensity that Aphrodite's gift provokes. Hermes gave Pandora a lying tongue and a cunning mind. Hermes was the trickster god, the boundary crosser, the god who moved between worlds and who was equally comfortable in the divine realm and the human one and the realm of the dead. His gift to Pandora was the gift of the confidence artist, the ability to say untrue things with such conviction that they become indistinguishable from true ones. This gift is described explicitly as a dangerous one in Hesiod, and it is one of the markers of Pandora as a punishment rather than simply a new form of companion for humanity. The combined effect of all these gifts was a being of overwhelming appeal, whose appeal concealed purposes that the appealing surface did not reveal. She was, in the most precise sense, a beautiful trap, and Epimetheus walked straight into it, because the trap was very beautiful indeed, and the future consequences were abstract, and she was standing right in front of him. The Orphic tradition and its different telling of the Pandora story. The Orphic tradition in ancient Greek religion was a mystical and philosophical movement that offered an alternative account of the cosmos and of human destiny to the mainstream Olympian religion, represented by Homer and Hesiod. The Orphics, who claimed their teachings derived from the mythical poet Orpheus, had their own creation myths and their own accounts of the origins of human suffering and the possibility of human redemption. In the Orphic tradition, the jar or vessel associated with the Pandora story was sometimes interpreted very differently from Hesiod's account. Rather than a container of evils released into the world, the Orphic jar was sometimes understood as a cosmic vessel, a symbol of the soul's containment in the body and of the divine elements that the soul carried within it. In the Orphic cosmology, human beings were created from the ashes of the Titans, who had been destroyed by Zeus after they killed and ate the divine child Dionysus. Human beings therefore contained within them both the titanic elements, the heavy, earthly, violent aspects of the Titans, and the divine elements, the Dionysian spark that the Titans had consumed and that now resided within human nature. The Orphic project was the liberation of the divine element within the human soul from the titanic matter that contained it. A process achieved through ritual purity, through the avoidance of certain foods and behaviors, and through initiation into the Orphic mysteries. The jar in this context becomes not a source of suffering, but a symbol of the soul's situation, the divine contained within the earthly, waiting to be released into the larger life that the Orphic initiate was promised after death. This Orphic reading of the container symbol is very different from Hesiod's Pandora myth, but it draws on the same deep association between jars and containment and release that the Pandora story exploits so powerfully. The Pythos is not only a storage jar and a burial container in the ancient Greek world, it is a symbol of the human condition itself. The condition of being a being who contains more than, is visible from outside, and whose contents, once released, change everything they touch. The Pandora myth and what it tells us about the nature of creation. At its deepest level, the Pandora myth is a story about creation and about the complicated relationship between creators and their creations. Zeus creates Pandora. The other gods contribute to her creation. But once she exists, Pandora is not simply an instrument of Zeus's will. She is a being who acts in the world, and whose actions have consequences that Zeus may or may not have fully anticipated. The evils that escape from the jar are not simply the things that Zeus wanted to send into the world. They are the full consequence of a creation that was more complex than any single intention could encompass. This aspect of the myth connects it to some of the deepest questions in the philosophy of creation. When you make something and release it into the world, you lose control of it. The thing you made begins to have effects that your original intention did not include and cannot contain. Mary Shelley understood this. So did the creators of nuclear weapons. So did the inventors of every technology that has produced consequences its inventors did not foresee. Pandora is the archetype of the created thing that exceeds the purposes of its creation. Zeus made her as a punishment. She became something more than that. A figure who carries within the tradition. She inhabits the full ambiguity of the female, the beautiful, the curious, the dangerous, the hope-bearing. The jar she opened was filled by Zeus, but it contained more than Zeus put in, or at least the effect of its opening has been more complex and more generative than a simple punishment narrative would suggest. The Pandora myth is a story about how creation always exceeds the intentions of the creator, and how the created thing, once released into the world, becomes part of a story that the creator cannot fully control. Zeus made Pandora to punish humanity. He succeeded, but he also, without intending to, gave humanity one of its most enduring stories. And in that story, at the bottom of the jar, he left hope. Whether he meant to or not is a question the myth has been asking for 3,000 years, and that it will probably still be asking 3,000 years from now. The ancient Greek understanding of hope and how it differs from ours. The Greek word elpis, usually translated as hope, had a somewhat different range of meaning in ancient Greek than the word hope has in modern English. In modern usage, hope tends to be a positive term. To hope is to anticipate something good. To live in hope is to maintain a positive orientation toward the future. Hope is generally considered a virtue, or at least a desirable state. In ancient Greek, elpis was a more neutral term. It referred to expectation about the future, which could be expectation of something good or something bad. You could have elpis that your crops would grow, and elpis that your enemy would attack you. Both were forms of anticipation about an unknown future, and both were described by the same word. This neutrality of meaning makes the presence of elpis in the jar more ambiguous than a straightforward translation, as hope suggests. If elpis is simply expectation about the future, then its presence in the jar alongside the diseases and the sorrows, and its remaining behind when they escape, is not straightforwardly comforting. It means that human beings retain the capacity to form expectations about the future, which is both what allows them to hope and what allows them to fear. The same faculty that produces hope produces dread. The same orientation toward an unknown future that allows human beings to believe things will get better also allows them to believe things will get worse. And the myth does not tell us which kind of elpis remained in the jar when Pandora closed it. Perhaps both. Perhaps the jar that remains closed contains both the hope that things will improve and the dread that they will not, the full range of human expectation about a future that has not yet arrived and therefore cannot yet be known. This reading makes the closed jar not simply a repository of hope, but a repository of human temporality itself, the irreducible condition of being a creature who lives in time and cannot know what time will bring. That is perhaps the most honest reading of what Pandora left us. Not certainty, not the guarantee of good things to come, but the capacity to face the future with expectation, in all its ambiguity and all its openness, because the future has not yet arrived, and what has not yet arrived has not yet proved impossible. The Pandora myth across different cultures and its echoes in world mythology. The story of a container that should not be opened, a prohibition that is violated, and consequences that follow, is not unique to the Greek tradition. Variants of this narrative pattern appear in mythological traditions from cultures that had no direct contact with ancient Greece, and whose independent development of similar stories suggests that the pattern addresses something genuinely universal in human experience. The tale of Bluebeard, the European folk story in which a wife is forbidden to open a specific room in her husband's castle and opens it anyway to discover the bodies of his previous wives, shares the basic structure of the Pandora myth while transposing it into a very different cultural and moral context. The Japanese myth of Urashima Taro, in which a fisherman is given a box by the sea princess and told never to open it, opens it when he returns home and discovers that centuries have passed, and releases from the box all the years of his absent life at once, parallels the Pandora story in its combination of prohibition, curiosity, opening, and irreversible consequence. The Native American tradition contains numerous stories of containers or bags that must not be opened and that release wind or cold or darkness when the prohibition is violated. In the Hindu tradition, the story of Savitri involves a kind of negotiation with death that shares thematic elements with the Greek myths about the relationship between mortality and the divine. The widespread occurrence of this narrative pattern across unconnected cultural traditions suggests that it addresses something genuinely universal about human experience, the experience of possessing something dangerous that is better left alone, the experience of curiosity as a force that overrides caution, the experience of consequences that cannot be undone, and the experience of finding, in the aftermath of those consequences, some remaining resource that makes continuation possible. These are not specifically Greek experiences, they are human ones. And the myth of Pandora has survived as long as it has, partly because it expresses those universal experiences in a form of unusual clarity and power. The jar is Greek. The story belongs to everyone. What remains when everything else is gone? The last thing to say about the Pandora myth is the simplest thing. When everything had escaped from the jar, and the jar was closed again, hope remained. Not because hope is invulnerable, not because hope cannot be lost or eroded or exhausted, but because on the day the jar was opened, hope was the one thing that stayed inside. The myth does not tell us why. It tells us that it did. And in telling us that it did, it offers us something that 3,000 years of human experience has found worth receiving. The world contains suffering. That is real. The world contains disease and loss, and old age and death, and the grinding labor of trying to sustain life in conditions that do not make it easy. All of that is real, and the myth does not pretend otherwise. But the world also contains hope, not as a reward, and not as a guarantee, and not as a promise that the suffering will end, but as a remaining possibility, as the thing at the bottom of the jar that has been there all along, and that has not escaped, and that is therefore still available to whoever needs to reach for it. The ancient Greeks who first heard this story lived in a world of real hardship. They farmed poor soil in a difficult climate. They buried their children more often than we do. They lived with the constant possibility of war and drought and plague. They knew about suffering from the inside in ways that make the world of the myth feel very close to the world of their daily lives. And they told themselves this story. The jar was opened. Everything escaped. But hope remained. That was enough. That has always been enough. 3,000 years later, we are still telling the story, because we are still in the world the jar created, and we still need to know that hope is at the bottom. It is still there. It has always been there. And it will be there tomorrow morning when the night is over and the day begins again.